The laughter echoed through the golden walls of Le Ciel Bleu, Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant. At the center of the noise sat Edward Langford, the billionaire everyone either feared or envied. His diamond cufflinks caught the light as he swirled his wine, eyes glinting with arrogance. "Tell me," he said, calling over the waitress, "what's your best investment advice?" His table of investors and socialites erupted in laughter, sharp, rehearsed, cruel. Clara stepped closer, her red apron crisp against her black uniform. She met his gaze with calm, steady eyes that didn't flinch under his. "You will go broke," she said, her voice low and precise, slicing through the laughter like a blade. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The clinking glasses, the hum of the restaurant, everything fell silent. Edward's smirk froze mid-air. Her words hung between them like smoke. Again, he wanted something in her tone, to laugh. The quiet certainty stripped the humor from the moment. His guests exchanged uneasy glances. For the first time that night, Edward Langford had no comeback. He watched her turn and walk away, the red apron disappearing through the swinging doors. A waiter dropped a spoon across the room, and the small metallic sound snapped the table back to motion. Laughter resumed, awkward and forced, but Edward wasn't listening anymore. He stared into his glass as if searching for an explanation at the bottom. Who was she? A waitress, yet she spoke with the confidence of someone who knew things, someone who had seen what others couldn't. The rest of the evening blurred. He nodded at jokes he didn't hear, smiled at stories he didn't care for, but in his mind, that single phrase repeated again and again, "You will go broke." It wasn't a threat. It sounded like a prediction, or worse, a fact already written. When the check came, he barely noticed that his hand trembled signing it. Clara, back in the kitchen, exhaled slowly. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence around her. One of the other waiters whispered, "What did you just say to him?" She only shook her head and muttered, "The truth." Her eyes, distant and heavy, carried the weight of someone who had been there before, too close to power, too close to ruin. Outside, the city glittered with 1,000 lights, each one a reminder of fortunes made and lost. Edward's black car slid through the streets, but he didn't see the skyline. Her words had carved a space inside his mind he couldn't close. "You will go broke." No one had ever spoken to him that way, not without consequence. He reached his penthouse, a glass palace overlooking Central Park, yet it felt smaller tonight. The silence inside pressed against his chest. He poured himself. Another drink, but even the whiskey didn't wash away the taste of humiliation. Pride had always been his armor, but now it felt like a weight dragging him down. In a small apartment across the city, Clara removed her apron and sat by the window. Her reflection in the glass looked older than she felt, or maybe just tired of pretending. She whispered into the night, "He doesn't even remember me." And yet deep down, she knew he would soon have no choice but to remember. Back at the penthouse, Edward replayed the evening in his mind. That waitress, her voice, her eyes, her certainty. He had mocked her, but something told him she wasn't the one being laughed at anymore. The empire he built suddenly felt fragile. He couldn't shake the feeling that the warning had already begun to unfold, and maybe it had. If you were in Clara's place, would you have spoken those words, or stayed silent? Tell me in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss what happens next, because this is just the beginning. Steam curled through the kitchen, fogging the stainless steel and brushing against Clara's face like ghosts from a life she'd tried to forget. Her hands moved automatically, arranging plates, checking orders, masking the tremor that betrayed her calm. Every clang of metal reminded her of laughter, his laughter, echoing through that golden dining room. She had spoken the truth, and now it wouldn't stop echoing inside her. She leaned against the counter, the smell of seared garlic and burnt butter thick in the air. For a moment, she closed her eyes and saw not the kitchen, but a glass office, one with her name once etched on the door. Her chest tightened. She forced herself to breathe, to focus on the orders before her. "Don't drift," she whispered to herself. "Not again." Marco, the head chef, shot her a quick glance. "You good, Clara?" he asked, voice rough from years of smoke and heat. She nodded, keeping her tone flat. "Fine." But he saw the lie in her eyes. He'd seen it in others too, that hollow look of someone fighting ghosts too loud to silence. He turned back to the stove, knowing better than to press. Out in the dining room, Edward Langford leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming on crystal. The echo of her words still clung to him like a stain. "You will go broke." No one had ever dared to speak to him like that, not without grovelling afterward. It wasn't rebellion that unsettled him. It was certainty. He couldn't stop wondering who she was. He turned to his assistant, a discreet man in a tailored suit. "Find out who that waitress is," Edward murmured. The assistant raised an eyebrow but nodded. Edward's tone was calm, but beneath it there was something else. A pulse of irritation he couldn't quite name. Curiosity, maybe, or fear. He finished his drink, trying to swallow the unease with it. Clara untied her apron after the shift ended and slipped out into the New York night. The air was wet with the smell of rain, reflections of neon signs swimming across the pavement. She walked quickly, not looking at anyone, clutching her coat against the wind. The city around her roared with life, but she felt detached, like an observer passing through a world that had once been hers. She paused at a store window and saw her reflection faintly in the glass. Tired eyes, hair escaping its tie, face drawn but steady. Once, that same reflection had been framed by skyscraper glass, outlined by ambition and confidence. Now, the only light behind her came from flickering street lamps. She turned away, unwilling to look at the ghost staring back. Meanwhile, Edward's car glided through the streets, sleek and silent. The lights outside blurred into streaks, but his thoughts were sharp and restless. There was something in her eyes, he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. His assistant looked up briefly, unsure whether to answer. Edward didn't notice. He was already somewhere else, somewhere years ago. Clara climbed the narrow stairs to her apartment building, each step creaking beneath her feet. The air smelled of dust and rain-soaked concrete. Inside, the space was small but clean. One table, one chair, one fragile piece she'd built out of routine. She placed her bag down carefully, as though it might explode if dropped too hard. On the corner of her table sat a faded business card, its edges worn from years of being touched, then hidden. She stared at the name printed in sharp black letters. Edward Langford, CEO, Langford Industries. For a long time, she said nothing. Then, quietly, she whispered, "You don't remember me, but you will." Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, and somewhere deep within her, something long dormant began to wake. Morning sunlight struck the skyline, glinting off the mirrored towers that bore Edward Langford's name. From his corner office, the city looked like an empire he had personally sculpted from ambition and ruthlessness. Below, traffic pulsed like veins, each car a fragment of the system he controlled. He stood before the window, sipping espresso, as if he owned the sunrise. Power wasn't something he earned anymore. It was simply who he was. His reflection in the glass was flawless, tailored suit, steady hands, no trace of doubt. But beneath that perfect surface, a single voice lingered. "You will go broke." It had followed him into his sleep and clung to his waking hours. He told himself it was nonsense, an irrelevant sting from a nobody. Yet, the memory of her gaze refused to fade. It had been calm, not defiant, like someone who already knew the ending. He turned away from the window and strode toward the conference table. A dozen executives stood waiting, murmuring numbers and forecasts. Their voices droned like static until Edward raised a hand. Silence fell instantly. "Gentlemen," he began, his tone precise, "we build, we buy, we dominate. Nothing else matters." Heads nodded. None of them dared disagree, not even when fear crept into their eyes. One of the younger analysts cleared his throat. "Sir, the Southport project. The numbers aren't aligning. There are red flags." Edward's gaze cut across the room like a blade. "Red flags," he repeated slowly, "are for the weak." Laughter followed, brittle and forced. But when he sat down, something inside him twisted, a flicker of uncertainty that didn't belong. As the meeting continued, he caught himself staring at the empty coffee cup in front of him. He'd built his empire on instinct, the kind that once felt infallible. Now, that instinct was quieter. Doubt, a feeling he despised, whispered beneath the noise of confidence. His assistant noticed his distraction and hesitated to speak. Edward waved him off. "I'm fine," he lied. Later that afternoon, the city's heartbeat changed. News screens lit up across the building, talk of rising steel prices, a supply shortage overseas. Nothing catastrophic, not yet. But Edward felt a tension ripple through the air, like the faint crack before glass shatters. "Diversify our holdings," he ordered sharply. "I want control." Control, the word he always used when he meant fear. When the boardroom emptied, Edward remained seated, his eyes drifting to the skyline again. The towers outside gleamed like trophies, but they looked colder now. He remembered his first deal, a handshake that cost someone else their company. He hadn't blinked then. That was years ago, before he stopped seeing faces, before the numbers became the only language he spoke. He poured another coffee and tried to drown the unease in caffeine and ego. "You will go broke," the memory whispered again. He set the cup down too hard, and it cracked against the saucer, a clean, sharp sound that startled him. For a moment, the illusion broke, the unshakable billionaire, startled by a phantom voice in his own head. He almost laughed at the absurdity. Almost. The city outside glimmered, indifferent to his unrest. Cars moved, people hustled, fortunes changed hands. He had once believed the world bent to his will, that money was gravity and he was its center. But something about that waitress's calm defiance had disturbed that orbit. He couldn't name it, but it lingered like static in the air, invisible yet electric. As dusk settled, Edward loosened his tie and leaned against the glass once more. Below, the lights of Manhattan flickered like embers in a vast furnace. His reflection stared back, confident, untouchable, unyielding. Yet, for the first time in years, he didn't recognize the man in the window. He felt like a stranger inside his own empire. Rain fell in thin silver threads, painting the city in reflections and blur. Clara's shoes splashed through shallow puddles as she made her way home, the chill seeping through her soles. The noise of Manhattan dimmed in her ears, replaced by the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. Each step away from the restaurant felt heavier, as if the weight of the past clung to her ankles. Tonight had awakened something she thought was dead. Her apartment waited in darkness, a single bulb flickering above the sink. She hung her coat, wrung the rain from her sleeves, and stood still. The silence pressed against her, thick and alive. For a moment she considered turning on the TV just to hear another voice. Instead, she walked to the window and watched the city lights smear across the wet glass. They reminded her of boardroom lights, sterile, merciless. She sat at the small wooden table, its surface scarred with years of use, and opened a drawer. Inside were fragments of a former life, A photo ID, a fountain pen, a folded newspaper clipping. Each item carried a ghost. She ran her thumb over the ID badge. Langford Industries, senior financial strategist. Her face stared back at her from another lifetime, confident and bright, before the storm came. That storm had a name: Edward Langford. She could still remember the first meeting, the way he walked into the conference room as if the air itself belonged to him. She'd admired him once. Everyone did. He was brilliance wrapped in arrogance, ambition sharpened to a weapon. And she had believed, foolishly, that standing beside him meant safety. The betrayal hadn't come suddenly. It was a slow bleed. Small decisions, quiet manipulations, documents signed in shadows. By the time she realized what he'd done, her division was gone, her accounts frozen, her reputation poisoned. The empire she helped build had consumed her without hesitation. In the end, her name was erased from every file, as if she'd never existed. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the room for an instant. The walls seemed smaller in that brief burst of white. She closed the drawer gently, almost reverently, as if tucking away the dead. But the ghost of that time never truly left. It haunted her in small ways, in every careless insult from a customer, in every reminder of how far she had fallen. She moved to the stove and made tea, hands steady now. There was a strange calm in remembering. It didn't sting like before. It simply was. The truth of her past no longer begged for pity. It demanded purpose. For years, she had survived by pretending she didn't care. But after tonight, indifference felt impossible. Seeing him again had torn open an old scar she could no longer ignore. Steam rose from the cup as she carried it to the table. The warmth soothed her fingers, grounding her in the present. She thought about the way Edward looked at her, confused, maybe even unnerved. He didn't recognize her, but some part of him had felt the echo, and that was enough. Revenge wasn't what she wanted anymore. What she wanted was to make him see. Outside, thunder rumbled across the skyline. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, Langford Industries gleamed like a monument to greed. Clara stared out at it through the rain, her reflection merging with the city lights. For years, she'd avoided this feeling, the pull between anger and justice. Tonight, she didn't resist it. She let it burn quietly, a flame she intended to control. She set the cup down and picked up the faded business card from the table once more. The ink was nearly gone, but the name was still clear. "Edward Langford," she whispered, as if speaking to the ghost himself. "You took everything from me." Her eyes hardened, steady and sure. "And you're about to remember exactly who I am." Morning light spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Langford Tower, slicing across polished marble and silent corridors. Edward's assistant, Thomas, stood at the threshold of his office, clutching a thin black folder. "Sir," he said cautiously, "you asked me to find out about the waitress." Edward didn't look up immediately. He was staring at the skyline again, the empire that bore his name. "And?" Thomas hesitated, eyes flicking to the file. "Her name is Clara Dawson, former senior financial strategist at Langford Industries. She was dismissed 7 years ago after the Calderon merger." The words hung in the air like dust. Edward's head turned sharply. "Clara Dawson," he repeated, as if tasting something familiar, yet distant. "That can't be right." He reached for the file and flipped it open. A photo stared back at him, younger, confident, alive. The memory surfaced like a shard through calm water. The boardroom, her voice explaining numbers that would make him millions, the respect she commanded before she vanished. "She worked for me," he murmured. "Briefly," Thomas replied, "until the acquisition that—" He stopped. He didn't need to finish. Edward already knew. For a long moment, Edward said nothing. He closed the folder, his jaw tightening. The merger had been ruthless, a necessary move, he'd told himself back then. The casualties were just numbers in a spreadsheet, names he barely remembered, but now one of those names had a face, a voice, and eyes that could still see through him. If she was as good as the record says, Thomas added, she shouldn't be a waitress. Edward's tone hardened. If she was that good, she wouldn't have fallen. It was meant to sound cold, dismissive, but even to his own ears the words felt hollow. He waved Thomas away and turned back toward the window. The city stretched. Below him, pulsing with the illusion of control, but his reflection in the glass didn't look as certain as before. There was a flicker of something else. Discomfort. Maybe guilt. Later that afternoon, Edward sat in the boardroom surrounded by numbers that no longer made sense. The Southport deal, the one he'd refused to second-guess, was unraveling. Investors were nervous. Forecasts were slipping. He could feel the air change when he walked into a room now. Conversations paused, glances darted. The scent of doubt was contagious, and he was starting to breathe it in. One of the senior partners cleared his throat. "Edward, we need to reconsider the expansion. The projections are fine," Edward cut in, sharper than intended. He hated weakness, especially when it echoed inside him. The partner fell silent, eyes down. Edward gathered the papers and stood abruptly. "If you don't trust my instincts," he said, "you shouldn't be here." The door slammed behind him like a gavel. Back in his office, he loosened his tie and sank into the leather chair. The city lights began to glow, faint against the storm clouds gathering outside. He poured himself a drink, but it tasted like nothing. The silence pressed closer, thick and restless. "You will go broke." The words surfaced again, not as an insult, but as prophecy. He clenched the glass until it cracked. He rose and paced across the room, the soles of his shoes echoing on the marble. He tried to recall every detail of her brilliance, her loyalty, the way she'd looked at him when the merger destroyed her department. Had she known, even then, what he was capable of? He wanted to dismiss the thought, but the memory wouldn't obey. It played in fragments. Her voice, her resignation, her silence. Outside, the first drops of rain hit the glass, streaking the skyline. Edward stood there watching them slide down, one after another, tracing invisible paths toward the ground. His empire still towered above the city, untouchable. Yet somewhere deep beneath the surface, a fault line had begun to form. Small, unseen, but spreading fast. And in that quiet moment, for the first time, Edward Langford wondered if the Waitress had been right. The first cracks appeared quietly, buried in numbers only the accountants noticed. A delayed shipment, a cancelled contract, a margin slipping by fractions that shouldn't have mattered, but did. Edward brushed them off as noise, the usual turbulence of big business. Still, when his finance director lingered outside his office door longer than usual, he felt the chill of something unspoken. "Come in," he said, already irritated. She stepped forward, holding a report to her chest like a confession. "The Southport investment is bleeding, sir. If we don't liquidate now, we could face exposure." Edward didn't look up. "Exposure builds resilience." The phrase sounded confident, mechanical, rehearsed, but the numbers on the page were merciless. The losses had doubled in a week. He signed the report without reading it again, as though his signature could rewrite the truth. By the end of the day, the first rumor reached the markets. Langford Industries, too leveraged, too aggressive, too arrogant. Traders smelled blood, and within hours the company's stock flickered red across the screens. Edward stood before the wall of monitors, watching the numbers fall like dominoes. Around him, assistants whispered into phones, voices tight with urgency. "It's temporary," he muttered, to no one in particular. He went home late that night, the city unusually quiet under a light drizzle. His penthouse windows reflected a version of him he didn't recognize, the man who once thought failure was for other people. The air felt heavier, harder to breathe. He loosened his tie, stared at the skyline, and thought of her. The waitress with the eyes that didn't flinch. "You will go broke," she had said. He'd laughed inside then. He wasn't laughing now. Across town, Clara stood in front of the flickering television in her apartment, the blue light painting her face in cold hues. The newscaster's voice filled the room, calm but merciless. "Langford Industries sees unexpected drop in valuation." She didn't smile. She didn't move. Only her eyes betrayed a storm, not of satisfaction but of recognition. She had seen this fall before, only from the inside. She turned off the TV and sat in silence. There was no triumph in watching someone drown, even if they once pushed you under. Still, she couldn't ignore the inevitability of it, like watching a tower crumble in slow motion. "You built it too high," she whispered to the empty room, "and you forgot the ground." Outside, lightning flickered across the clouds, echoing the tension that hummed through the city. Meanwhile, Edward faced his boardroom again, the same table, the same faces, but none of the same certainty. "We stay the course," he said, his tone clipped, his jaw tight. One of the directors shifted uneasily. "With respect, sir, the market doesn't agree with you." The air thinned. Edward's eyes sharpened, his voice colder. "Then the market will learn." It was pride speaking now, not logic. That night, the company's losses tripled. The media caught wind of internal discord. Headlines bloomed like fire. Edward's name, once synonymous with power, now carried the scent of panic. He stared at the news ticker as it scrolled his empire's obituary in real time. The words didn't register as real. He'd been untouchable for so long that the idea of falling felt like fiction, yet here it was, fact, written in red. He slept little, haunted by numbers that danced behind his eyelids. Every dream began with laughter, his own, and ended with silence. He woke to phone calls, urgent and endless, but none carried solutions. The storm outside grew louder, hammering the glass like a warning he refused to hear. He poured a drink, though it was barely dawn, and told himself this was just another test of strength. But deep down, beneath the layers of arrogance and denial, Edward felt it. The shift, the unraveling of control. It wasn't just his company at stake, it was the illusion that had built his identity. For years, he'd treated fear like weakness. Now, it had become his shadow. And somewhere in the noise of the rain and the sirens below, one voice still echoed clear and calm in his mind. "You will go broke." The rain had stopped, but the city still glistened under the grey morning light. Edward's car pulled up in front of Le Ciel Bleu once again. He told himself it was coincidence, that he needed breakfast, clarity, normalcy. But the truth lingered. Under his breath, like a confession, he wanted to see her, the waitress who had cracked the surface of his composure, the woman whose words refused to leave his mind. Inside, the restaurant was quieter than usual, the air heavy with the scent of coffee and polished silver. Clara moved through the tables with practiced grace, her steps measured, her eyes distant. She hadn't expected to see him again. When she looked up and found him standing near the entrance, her pulse stumbled. For a moment, neither of them moved. Two ghosts staring across the line between power and memory. Edward gestured for a table, his tone polite, almost too polite. "Table for one," he said, though his gaze never left her. She hesitated, then nodded and led him to a corner seat by the window. The world outside blurred through the glass. Cars, rain, people who didn't know they were standing inside a story years in the making. She placed a menu in front of him, her hand steady despite the storm inside her chest. Coffee, he said softly. Black. She wrote it down even though she didn't need to. The silence between them was a living thing, pressing against every breath. Finally, he spoke again. We've met before, haven't we? The words were careful, almost fragile. She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes met his, and something inside him shifted. Recognition, faint, Clara's voice was calm when it came. A long time ago. She didn't offer more, and he didn't deserve more. Edward leaned forward slightly. You worked for me. You don't remember? She asked, her tone still even but her eyes sharp. You made sure of that. The words landed like glass breaking, quiet but irreversible. He blinked, stunned, the weight of the past pressing against his ribs. He searched her face for anger, for accusation, but found something far worse, composure. She wasn't there for revenge. She was there to exist, proof that he couldn't erase her completely. The calm in her voice unsettled him more than any shout could have. Why didn't you... he began, then stopped. There was no good ending to that question. Clara turned slightly, looking toward the window, her reflection framed beside his. Because I wanted to see how long it would take, she said quietly. For what? He asked. For you to notice what you destroyed. Her tone wasn't bitter. It was simply true. He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. The hum of the restaurant filled the silence, cutlery, murmurs, the soft echo of a life that moved on without them. When she returned with his coffee, her movements were steady, controlled. He wanted to say something, an apology, a defense, anything to fill the space, but the words refused to form. Clara placed the cup before him, the faint clink echoing louder than it should have. For a moment, he saw the woman she used to be, sharp, confident, unyielding, and realized that he was the reason she no longer was. He watched her walk away, her red apron trailing like a quiet flag of defiance. Around him, the restaurant returned to its rhythm, but the air between them stayed fractured. He sat motionless, the coffee untouched, the bitterness of truth already burning on his tongue. The past wasn't something he could outspend or outthink. It had a name, a voice, a heartbeat. As Clara disappeared behind the kitchen door, Edward exhaled slowly, the sound trembling. For years he had believed the world existed in two kinds of people, winners and those who served them. But today, watching her vanish into the clatter of dishes and steam, he realized he'd been wrong. The collision wasn't between classes or wealth, it was between guilt and memory, and he was standing in the wreckage of both. The city glowed like embers that night, flickering with light and secrets. Edward sat in his office long after everyone had gone, the room dim except for the reflection of the skyline bleeding across the windows. He couldn't stop seeing her face, the calm defiance, the steadiness of someone who had already survived his worst. He poured another drink, but it did nothing to silence the echoes. You made sure of that, she had said. The words dragged him backward through years he'd buried. He saw boardrooms, lit by cold fluorescence, faces leaning over contracts, ambition masked as loyalty, and then her, Clara Dawson. Her laughter once filled these very halls, sharp and bright like the click of her heels against marble floors. She had been one of his best, numbers precise, instincts flawless, loyal to a fault, until she wasn't. He remembered the day the Calderon merger came through. She'd argued against it, her voice steady but insistent. It's a trap, she had said. Their assets are inflated. He hadn't listened. He never did when someone told him no. Instead, he'd smiled that practice smile and told her to trust the vision. Months later, the fallout began, and her department was the first casualty. When the scandal hit, he didn't take her calls. He told himself she'd recover, find work elsewhere, start again. But he knew better. In their world, reputation was currency. And hers had been shredded overnight. He'd let it happen, not out of cruelty, but convenience. He needed a scapegoat, and she was close enough. Her name absorbed the blame like paper soaking ink. Clara remembered that day too, though the memory came differently, in flashes of humiliation, of voices whispering as she packed her things. The elevator ride down from the 40th floor had felt endless. When the doors opened, the city no longer belonged to her. She wandered the streets that night with nothing but a cardboard box and the weight of her silence. That was the last night she believed in fairness. The flashbacks flickered through her mind as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Rain tapped against the window, a sound both comforting and cruel. She had spent years building walls around those memories, not to forget, but to survive. Yet seeing Edward again had cracked those walls open. Old wounds didn't bleed, but they burned, deep and invisible. Back in his tower, Edward turned off the lights and stood in the dark. The city below pulsed, oblivious to the ghosts it had made. He tried to convince himself that her anger was misplaced, that he had done what any businessman would. But the lie felt heavy in his mouth. He saw her again in his mind, the way she'd looked at him in the restaurant, not with hate, but with something colder, clarity. He sat at his desk and opened an old digital archive, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Her name appeared in the search results, attached to reports he barely remembered. Reading her work now felt like uncovering evidence of a crime he didn't realize he'd committed. Each document bore her precision, her brilliance. He closed the screen, shame tightening around his throat like a collar. Across the river, Clara stood by her window watching the same skyline. Somewhere in those towers, the man who had dismantled her life was awake, haunted by the same ghosts. The thought didn't comfort her. It only deepened the ache. Because deep down, she knew he wasn't a monster, just a man who had forgotten how to feel the cost of his own ambition. For the first time in years, both of them were awake under the same storm, each trapped in their own version of the past. Edward with guilt he couldn't name, Clara with pain she'd taught herself not to show. And though they didn't know it yet, that shared sleeplessness marked the start of something neither could control. The quiet beginning of reckoning. The morning after the storm, the city rose under a thin veil of fog. Inside Langford Tower the mood had shifted, quiet, tense, brittle. Edward entered the lobby to find whispers trailing behind him like shadows. Phones rang with urgency, screens flashed with red numbers. He didn't need reports to know what they meant. The empire he'd spent a lifetime constructing was beginning to tremble. In the boardroom, the atmosphere felt heavier than the air before a storm. His executives avoided his eyes, their usual rehearsed confidence now replaced with restraint. "The market reacted to Southport again," one of them said. "Investors are pulling out." Edward clasped his hands on the table. The gesture meant to signal control, but his knuckles were white. "Let them pull," he said. "We'll recover." But the words rang false, even to him. He caught sight of his reflection in the dark window across the room. A familiar face, but not the same. The arrogance had dulled, replaced by something quieter, something uneasy. He realized with a strange pang that his power had always depended on fear, the kind that kept people obedient, even when they saw him falter. Now, that fear was fading. News spread faster than truth. By noon, headlines shouted phrases like "Langford declines" and "the fall of a giant." Edward's phone buzzed endlessly, journalists, bankers, investors, all circling like vultures sensing decay. He ignored them all. The more he fought the noise, the louder it became. The world smelled weakness, and it never forgave it. He stepped into his private office and shut the door, the sound echoing in the silence. On the shelf behind him sat awards and plaques, engraved reminders of his dominance. They looked different now, smaller, meaningless, like relics of a kingdom already dead. He poured himself water, but his hand shook as he lifted the glass. It wasn't the company collapsing that terrified him. It was the slow realization that maybe he had caused it. Across town, Clara sat in a small cafe during her break, the newspaper open before her. She didn't seek the headlines, but they found her anyway. Edward's face filled half the page, confident as ever, yet somehow desperate. She studied the image for a long moment. Once, that same face had been untouchable. Now, she could see the cracks beneath the polish. But instead of satisfaction, she felt only heaviness. She folded the paper and looked out the window, watching the rain return in soft patterns. The fall of a man like Edward Langford wasn't just his own. It left collateral. The people under him, the workers, the families who depended on his empire. Clara knew that better than anyone. Her anger had cooled into something different now, not forgiveness, but understanding. Every tower cast a shadow, and his was finally catching up to him. Back in the tower, the day stretched endlessly. Calls turned into arguments, meetings into chaos. Edward's closest advisor, a man who once swore loyalty, tendered his resignation without a word. The betrayal burned, but not as much as the truth that followed it. No one believed he could fix this anymore. He had built his world on control, and now he couldn't even command faith. As evening fell, the offices emptied one by one, leaving Edward alone with the hum of the city. He loosened his tie and stared out the window. The lights below seemed to flicker in time with his heartbeat, uneven, uncertain. He could almost feel the empire sinking beneath his feet, floor by floor. For years he had measured worth by what he owned. Now he couldn't remember what worth even meant. Somewhere beyond the skyline, Clara walked home, the wind tugging at her coat. She didn't know that at that same moment Edward was standing in the dark, watching the same horizon. The distance between them wasn't space, it was time, guilt, and the echoes of choices long made. The cracks in his empire weren't just structural, they were personal, and they had her name written all over them. The following morning, Edward's reflection in the mirror looked like a man rehearsing composure. His tie was perfect, his suit immaculate, but the mask had cracks now. Hair slightly unkempt, eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. He had spent the night pacing between screens, spreadsheets, and silence. There was only one thought he couldn't shake: Clara Dawson. The name clung to his mind like a riddle demanding to be solved. By noon, he made the decision. "Find her," he told Thomas, his voice quiet but absolute. The assistant hesitated, not out of disobedience, but uncertainty. "Sir, what exactly do you intend to do?" Edward didn't answer right away. His gaze fell on the skyline outside, where the clouds were gathering again. "Offer her a job," he said finally. "I need someone who sees what I can't." The words tasted strange, humility mixed with desperation. Hours later, the restaurant's familiar scent of citrus and polished wood greeted him. Clara was behind the counter this time, checking receipts, her hair tied back neatly. When she saw him, her hand froze mid-air. For a moment the world narrowed to the space between them. He approached slowly, like a man entering a confessional. "Clara," he said, her name sounding foreign in his mouth. "We need to talk." She looked at him with the same composure she'd shown before, though her pulse quickened. "You've already said enough," she replied, "and so have I." Edward shook his head. "No, I mean business." The irony wasn't lost on her. The man who had dismantled her career now wanted her expertise. She folded her arms, studying him. "Business is what ruined everything, Mr. Langford." He gestured toward a nearby table, ignoring the curious eyes of the staff. "Please," he said, and his tone carried something new, not command, but plea. She sat, more out of curiosity than mercy. Edward slid a folder across the table, filled with financial data and crumbling projections. "You warned me once," he said. "You were right. I didn't listen. I need your help now." Clara opened the folder slowly. Charts, losses, percentages, the anatomy of decline. She recognized the numbers instantly. They spoke the same language as betrayal. "You think this is about money?" she asked, not looking up. "You think I care about saving what destroyed me?" Edward's jaw tightened. "I think you care about being right." The words hung between them, sharp and deliberate. She met his gaze then, eyes steady, voice low. "You still don't understand. I was never trying to win. I was trying to warn you." Edward said nothing. His confidence faltered for the first time in front of her, and the silence that followed wasn't about power. It was about truth. "You built everything on control," she continued, "but you never learned how to listen." For a moment, Edward almost smiled, not in amusement but in acknowledgement. "Then teach me," he said. The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. She searched his face for manipulation and found exhaustion instead, the kind that comes from running too long from one's own reflection. She closed the folder and leaned back, the decision already forming in her mind. "No," she said softly, "I'm not here to fix you, Edward. Not your company, not your conscience." Her calm was unnerving, the kind born from surviving the worst someone could do to you. "You don't want help," she added. "You want redemption without change." His mouth opened to respond, but no words came. For once, the man who always had the last word had none. Clara stood, pushing the chair back gently. "If you really want to rebuild," she said, gathering her things, "start by listening." So she walked away, leaving him alone at the table, surrounded by the ruins of numbers that once made him invincible. Outside, the rain began again, tapping softly against the glass. Edward watched her disappear into the grey, the folder still unopened before him, a map of his downfall written by his own hand. The news broke before dawn. Screens across the financial district glowed with the same headline, "Langford Industries declares insolvency." The word spread like wildfire through the veins of the city. By the time Edward arrived at the office, the lobby was a battlefield of cameras, reporters and lawyers in expensive panic. His empire, once the symbol of dominance, had turned into a cautionary tale overnight. Security cleared a path for him, but the noise followed. Questions hurled like stones. What went wrong? Did you know? How much did you lose? Edward kept walking, eyes straight ahead, voice silent. Every flash of a camera felt like an accusation. He reached the elevator, pressed the top floor, and closed his eyes. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. It sounded like defeat. Upstairs, the boardroom was nearly empty. Those who once fought for his attention now avoided his gaze. A few, brave enough to stay, looked at him not with loyalty, but with pity. The screens showed numbers bleeding red, his company's value evaporating in real time. Edward stood in front of the monitors, his reflection flickering between power and ruin. "Shut them off," he said. The order carried no authority anymore. When the lights dimmed, the room felt hollow, stripped of illusion. He turned toward the window, staring out at the city that had once bent to his will. Everything below looked smaller now, almost unreal. He thought of Clara's words, the calm certainty in her voice. "You will go broke." It wasn't prophecy. It was consequence. He just hadn't recognized it until now. In the chaos below, employees packed boxes, phones rang unanswered, and deals dissolved mid-sentence. Years of loyalty disintegrated in hours. Edward watched it unfold like a man observing his own autopsy. Every success, every ruthless decision, every compromise he once justified, it all pointed back to this. The empire hadn't fallen, It had imploded, and he was the fuse. By midday, the court summons arrived. Creditors demanded explanation, accountability, blood. His lawyers spoke in tones of damage control, but Edward barely listened. He could hear only the hum of rain against the glass. "We can settle quietly," one of them said. "Walk away with what remains." He nodded, though the words barely reached him. Walk away from what? He had nothing left to carry but guilt. Outside the courthouse later that week, the world turned against him in flashes and noise. Reporters shouted his name, their voices a chorus of mockery and disbelief. Once the cameras had worshipped him, now they devoured him. He didn't fight it. He simply kept walking, hands in his pockets, through the storm of questions and judgment. Pride, the armor he'd worn all his life, had finally cracked open. Clara saw the footage on a small television in the restaurant kitchen. The staff gathered for a moment, whispering between orders. She didn't join them. She dried her hands on her apron and turned away, though her reflection lingered in the glass of a steel refrigerator, quiet, unreadable. She had imagined this day once, long ago. But now that it was here, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like closure she hadn't asked for. That night, Edward returned to his penthouse. The air was still, heavy with dust and the faint smell of cologne that no longer suited him. He moved through the rooms in silence, past the art, the empty decanters, the view that once defined success. The city lights below no longer looked like gold, only distance. For the first time in his life, he realized he was truly alone. He sat by the window, the same spot where he'd once toasted to victory, and watched the rain return. It fell harder now, relentless, cleansing. His phone buzzed with messages he didn't answer. His empire was gone, but something deeper was beginning to stir. A quiet, unbearable clarity. "You will go broke." The words that once felt like an insult now sounded almost merciful, because in losing everything he had finally met himself. The city was quiet when Edward woke, the kind of quiet that follows ruin. No calls, no meetings, no voice demanding his attention. Only the hum of the refrigerator and the whisper of wind against the glass. His penthouse, once a monument to excess, now felt cavernous and cold. He walked through it barefoot, the marble floor echoing his steps back at him like a reminder that he was the only thing left inside his empire. Dust had begun to settle on the trophies lining his shelves, each engraved with promises of greatness. Visionary of the Year, Architect of Tomorrow. Hollow titles that now sounded cruel in the silence. He ran a finger over one of the plaques, tracing the letters until they blurred. They didn't mean success anymore. They meant blindness, the refusal to see when everything had already begun to fall apart. He stopped by the window and looked down at the streets below. From this height, the city moved like a living organism. Taxis, pedestrians, umbrellas, opening and closing like lungs. For years, he believed he had mastered that pulse, bent it to his will. Now, it beat on without him. The realization was both humbling and devastating. The world didn't even pause to notice his absence. On the table near the couch lay the remnants of the night before, an untouched drink, a stack of legal documents, a half-written apology he'd never send. His handwriting looked shaky, foreign. He read the first line again. "I built walls where I should have built bridges." He couldn't remember when he'd written it, or why he'd stopped, maybe because the next sentence would have required honesty, and he still wasn't sure he was ready for that. He walked into the empty kitchen, opened the fridge out of habit, and found nothing but light. No staff, no chef, no order, just silence. He thought of Clara again, of her quiet strength, her refusal to gloat, her calm in the face of his arrogance. She had once looked at him the way a surgeon looks at a wound, not with disgust, but with the knowledge that pain must be faced before it can heal. The sky outside turned pale with morning. Edward sat on the floor near the window, the city stretching endlessly below. He thought of all the people he had used, dismissed, or forgotten, the faces behind contracts, the voices drowned by ambition. He had always believed guilt was for the weak, yet now it was the only thing keeping him human. The weight of it pressed on his chest, but for once he didn't push it away. He turned on the television just to hear another voice. The screen came to life with news of his downfall, analysts dissecting every mistake, every gamble, every sign he had ignored. Watching strangers narrate his collapse was surreal. They spoke of him like a character in a story that had already ended. He turned off the TV, the silence returning heavier than before. The hours passed without meaning. Afternoon became evening without him noticing. He wandered from room to room like a ghost, surrounded by everything he had once valued. The penthouse, with its glass walls and panoramic views, felt less like a home and more like a cage. It was the kind of beauty that mocked the man who built it. As night fell, the city lights shimmered through the rain, scattering gold across his reflection. Edward stood still, watching himself fade in and out of the glass. He looked older now, not from time, but from truth. The power, the pride, the certainty, all stripped away. For the first time in his life, he didn't know who he was without them. He sank into the armchair by the window and closed his eyes. The faint hum of traffic below sounded almost like the sea. In that sound, he found something unfamiliar, peace, fragile and tentative. Losing everything hadn't destroyed him. It had emptied him, made space for something new, though he couldn't name it yet. Outside, dawn approached again, pale and forgiving, over the city that no longer belonged to him. Weeks passed in quiet repetition. The penthouse remained untouched, but Edward's world had shrunk to a few blocks. A cafe where no one recognized him, a park bench overlooking the river, the library where he read about things he once dismissed as useless, ethics, compassion, humility. He didn't know what he was looking for exactly. He only knew that survival wasn't enough. He needed to matter again, differently this time. One afternoon, as he walked through the Lower East Side, he saw a poster taped to a lamppost, community finance program, free consultation for families in debt. The handwriting below caught his eye, neat, deliberate. Instructor, Clara Dawson. For a moment, he thought it was coincidence or perhaps punishment, but curiosity pulled stronger than shame. Before he could talk himself out of it, he followed the address. The community center was small, painted in faded blues and yellows. Inside, a group of people sat around folding tables with notebooks and calculators. At the front of the room stood Clara, her hair tied back, sleeves rolled up, voice calm but full of life. She explained budgets and savings with the same precision she once used for billion-dollar projections, but now her words weren't about profit. They were about survival. Edward stood by the door, unnoticed at first. Watching her, he felt something he hadn't in years. Admiration without ownership. She was doing what he never learned to do. Build something that wasn't about himself. When she finally saw him, her voice faltered for half a second, but she recovered quickly. "We'll take a short break," she said to the class, and walked toward him. He tried to speak, but the words came out uneven. "I didn't come to interfere." "Then why are you here?" she asked, not coldly, but with weary honesty. He looked around the room, the worn desks, the tired faces, the quiet hope. "Because this is what I should have built." Clara crossed her arms, studying him. "You can't fix the past by showing up uninvited to the present." He nodded, accepting the blow. "I'm not here to fix it. I'm here to learn." The humility in his tone disarmed her for a moment. The man before her was no longer the titan of glass towers, but something smaller, and somehow more real. "Then sit," she said after a pause, gesturing to an empty chair. "And listen. That's how everyone starts here." Edward obeyed. He took the seat beside an older woman struggling to balance her. Checkbook and a young man worried about losing his apartment. Their stories unfolded around him, stories of loss, debt, resilience. For the first time, Edward didn't feel above them. He felt among them. Every figure they wrote down, every tearful admission, carried a weight he finally understood. During the next hour, he didn't speak once. He took notes, listened, and learned. When the class ended, he stayed behind, helping stack chairs and gather papers. Clara watched him quietly, uncertain of his intentions, but unable to deny the sincerity in his movements. The arrogance that once defined him had vanished, replaced by something simpler, the desire to do right, even if too late. As they stood by the door, she finally asked, "What do you want from this, Edward?" He thought for a long moment before answering. "A chance to be useful again. Not powerful, just useful." The simplicity of his answer caught her off guard. For the first time, she saw not the man who had taken everything from her, but one who had lost himself in the process. And maybe, just maybe, she saw the possibility of change. Outside, the evening air was cool and quiet. Edward walked out of the centre feeling lighter, though nothing tangible had changed. The streets around him were still cracked, the city still indifferent. But for the first time in years, he wasn't chasing control or redemption. He was walking toward understanding, one step, one lesson, one act of humility at a time. The days turned into weeks, and Edward became a familiar face at the community centre. He arrived early, stayed late, and listened more than he spoke. The man who once built towers now carried chairs, sorted forms, and poured coffee for volunteers. At first, people whispered his name with disbelief, unsure whether to trust his intentions. But slowly, through quiet persistence, the whispers faded into acceptance. Clara watched him from a careful distance. She wasn't convinced yet. Redemption was a word she didn't hand out easily. But something in his consistency disarmed her. He never asked for credit, never mentioned his past, never looked for acknowledgement. He just worked. It was strange, almost unsettling, to see someone who had lived in skyscrapers move so humbly among those who had nothing. One afternoon, she found him alone in one of the classrooms, erasing figures from a whiteboard. "You missed a decimal," she said lightly, stepping in. He smiled faintly. "Old habits die hard." "Or don't," she replied. Their eyes met, not as adversaries anymore, but as two people standing on the same ground. The silence that followed wasn't tense. It was fragile, human, real. She sat beside him at the desk. "You could rebuild your fortune if you wanted to," she said quietly. "You still have the mind for it." He shook his head. "Fortunes rot faster than guilt," he answered. "If I build something again, it won't be for me." The simplicity of the statement lingered between them. For the first time, she believed he might mean it. That evening they drafted an idea together. Not a corporation, not a brand, a foundation. A place where people could learn financial literacy, rebuild credit, and start again without exploitation. They sketched plans on scrap paper, arguing over names, laughing for the first time in years. The sound surprised them both. Laughter unguarded and clean, echoing in a room that once only knew tension. Within months, the Langford Dawson initiative took shape in a repurposed warehouse downtown. Old desks found new purpose. Volunteers came from every corner of the city. They offered workshops, counseling, and small grants funded by what remained of Edward's liquidated assets. For the first time, his money was helping people instead of crushing them. Clara oversaw the programs, and Edward handled the logistics. Together, they built balance. The media eventually caught on, but this time, the cameras didn't find extravagance. They found humility. When journalists asked Edward about his fall and his so-called comeback, he refused the narrative of rebirth. "It's not a comeback," he told them. "It's correction." His voice carried no bitterness, no performance, just truth. It disarmed critics faster than any PR statement ever could. Clara saw him change in small ways. He no longer rushed to fill silence, no longer looked past people when they spoke. He had learned to listen, not just to words, but to stories. The arrogance that once powered his success had been replaced by empathy, quiet and enduring. For the first time, she didn't see the man who ruined her life. She saw the man who was finally trying to understand it. Late one night, as they closed the center together, Clara asked softly, "Do you ever miss it? The power?" Edward smiled, a weary, knowing kind of smile. "No," he said. "Power never really belonged to me. I just borrowed it from people I didn't respect." The honesty of it hung in the air. Clara didn't reply. She didn't need to. His words were proof enough. When they stepped outside, the city lights shimmered across the river, reflecting off the windows of buildings that once bore his name. They stood side by side, not as enemies, not as symbols, but as two people who had survived the same story. For the first time, Edward didn't feel the need to explain himself. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was peace. Years later, the conference hall filled with a quiet anticipation. Rows of chairs faced a modest stage where a simple banner hung. Langford Dawson Initiative, 5 years of second chances. Edward stood behind the curtain, adjusting his tie, not out of vanity but habit. His reflection in the mirror looked different now. The sharpness had softened. The power once worn like armor had transformed into something gentler, purpose. He glanced through the curtain and saw Clara at the front row, speaking with volunteers. Her laughter drifted through the room like a familiar melody. The sight grounded him, steadied his breath. For a moment he remembered the restaurant, the humiliation, the fall, the long road from arrogance to humility. Every mistake, every scar had led to this moment. He wasn't proud, he was grateful. When he stepped on stage, the applause came not from awe, but respect, a quieter, truer sound. He waited for it to fade before speaking. "I used to think success was about winning," he began, "about having more, doing more, being untouchable. But life has a way of reminding us that the higher you build walls, the further you fall." The audience leaned in, listening. His voice carried the weight of someone who had truly fallen and risen differently. He gestured toward Clara. "This initiative exists because someone once told me a truth I refused to hear. She said, 'You will go broke.' And she was right. I lost everything, money, reputation, pride. But what I gained was worth more than all of it. I learned that wealth isn't measured in what you keep, but in what you give back." The hall was silent, every word landing like a promise. Clara met his eyes across the stage, a faint smile touching her lips. Forgiven him long ago, though neither of them ever said the word aloud. Forgiveness wasn't an event. It was something that unfolded quietly, day by day, in acts of shared purpose. In her gaze, Edward didn't see judgment anymore, only understanding. And that was enough. He concluded his speech simply. "The best advice I ever received didn't come from a billionaire or a boardroom. It came from someone the world underestimated. Someone who had every reason to hate me, but chose instead to teach me." He paused, his voice lowering. "If I've learned anything, it's this. Pride isolates, but humility connects, and connection is the only kind of wealth that lasts." Applause rose again, loud and sustained this time. The crowd stood, many wiping their eyes. Edward stepped back, the light from the projector washing over him in gold. In that glow, he didn't see redemption or victory. He saw balance, the rare, quiet satisfaction of finally becoming the man he pretended to be. It wasn't triumph, it was peace. After the ceremony, he and Clara walked outside together. The evening breeze carried the scent of rain, just like the night they first met. The city stretched before them, vast and alive, but no longer intimidating. "You were right," Edward said softly. "About everything." She smiled, looking at the skyline. "No, Edward. You were just late to the truth." He laughed, not the arrogant laugh of the past, but something lighter, freer. They stopped at the steps of the building as volunteers filtered out behind them, their chatter fading into the night. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Clara turned to him and said, "You know, not everyone gets to rewrite their story." He nodded. "I didn't rewrite it," he said. "I just learned to read it differently." The honesty in his tone made her smile again. As they walked away, the camera of the world panned upward, the city lights glimmering like stars caught in motion, the sound of distant traffic blending with laughter. The skyline that once symbolized greed now shimmered with renewal, and as Edward's voice echoed softly in narration, it carried one final truth. Sometimes the richest people are the ones who've lost everything and learned why it mattered. If this story moved you, don't leave just yet. Take a moment to subscribe to the channel. There are more stories like this waiting to be told, and when you're ready, click on the video appearing on your screen, because the next story might just change the way you see the world.